Your Bluetooth can't be off, that's why it's keeping me again.
I think I switched my Bluetooth off. Maybe I need to check again. Hold on, guys.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay.
There we go.
Back on. I keep on forgetting to switch my Bluetooth off, so that's responsible for the dropout. I think it was last week.
Last week, yeah.
Last week, yeah. Anyway, good morning, guys.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. Another week.
Another week, and it's a special week, isn't it?
A week of love.
Week of love, Valentine's week.
I'm still waiting for you to ask me if I'll be your Valentine.
I will.
You're running out of time. What if someone else asks?
Yeah, I never thought about that too. I haven't thought about that for 18 years, to be honest. Anyway, we're having a Valentine's dinner with the kids. Yeah, we've got 3 kids and now we got to eat.
Yeah, just something
with them.
different.
Yeah.
Instead of dropping him off at babysitters,
Yes. We're having a Valentine's evening dinner here with the kids on Tuesday. Anyway, that's what you do when you're old and married, I guess. They will go to bed at some point.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No comment.
No comment beyond
Beyond the kids'
any
bedtime.
of that. Yes. If you're joining us, it's so nice to have you with us. If you're listening to the podcast, welcome to France and Tori. We are out here in our garden, and that's why you're going to be hearing a little bit of car noises, some wind now and again.
Hopefully not too much.
Not too much. We try not to be too scripted and just speaking from things that have touched us and things that are busy changing us, I guess. Yeah.
So we're talking about love.
We're talking about love. Well, this is number 6 today. So, if this is our first episode that you're joining us for, the other ones kind of link into this one, I guess. They need to be listened to in like a kind of a sequence, I guess, to make the point clear. But today we addressing the idea that fear is not love, which seems to be an obvious thing for most people. In fact, it's actually a quote from the New Testament, from John. It does make sense to a lot of people that fear cannot be love.
Yeah.
It's just that when we're dealing with a book like Deuteronomy, and that's kind of where we are at the moment. Last week we looked at Deuteronomy, and reading it for what it's saying, it's a bit harsh, you know. I mean, it's
There's a lot of fear.
there's a lot of fear in there. You know, I think you could make the argument in Deuteronomy that it is a fear-based motivational letter. Maybe at best you could say there's fear and love working together in perfect harmony. But then you're stuck with what John speaks about, and kind of John is saying, no, but
They
love
can't work together.
they don't actually work together. They are, to some degree, they're mutually exclusive. They don't hold part in each other. They are not shareholders of each other.
Yeah.
So that's a bit tricky. Anyway, to get to that today, we're going to be looking at some historical context for the book of Deuteronomy. So this is quite important because last week, I know this might not sit so well with everyone, but it seems to me quite clear that the book of Deuteronomy is kind of not what we expect from the father of Jesus that we meet in the New Testament, right? And so it's a little bit tricky because the book is riddled with, you know, if you love me, or I will love you if you do all these things.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the book is about, but you better love me, or I will do all these things to you. And those things in the book of Deuteronomy, they are not nice things. Sorry,
Yeah.
it's fear-based. And that's the simplicity of the book. And I always challenge people to just go read it again, especially Christians who have just ignored it and kind of assimilated Deuteronomy into the God of love, and then just struggling, or actually just never go to struggle and wrestle with it. And once it comes for you, once you can't ignore it, then you have issues. So
Yeah.
for me, it was just a journey of realizing what Deuteronomy was actually saying when I read it plainly. And then the hard part for Christians like me and you is that we need to ask, why is it like this? Why is it like this? And secondly, what do we actually do with a book
Yeah.
that looks like this? So that's what we're doing today.
Yeah. But I mean, although you say historical context, like I feel like I need to say, to the listeners, like, but don't worry, because I'm not passionate, admittedly, about history.
Deuteronomy, you don't.
No, about
Do
history
you know
in general, actually.
the blessings of Bahat?
No. And I'm not, so, like, when I want to hear something that's going to, like, change my mind, or, like, when you say history, I'm like, okay, can you tell me when to listen again? But when you showed me what the content is of today's subject, I actually found it very interesting, because it gets me to the end where I need to go. And
Yes.
go, oh, okay,
So,
that makes sense. So, like,
I mean, that's the
for
point
those that
of
feel
today.
like me about history, just sit tight. It's not as bad as it sounds.
Well, I think that's the point of today, is that we want people to have some form of an answer as to why this book looks like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so having a quick look at Deuteronomy, today we're going to do a little bit of work through the book of Deuteronomy. So what's really interesting and weird about Deuteronomy is that when you read the middle of the book, there are portions where it seems like it's Moses writing and talking. But the beginning and the end of the book doesn't look like the middle of the book. It is obviously written in third person. So we're going to be having a look at some of those things. But just before we do that, the presumed setting for Deuteronomy is after approximately 40 years in the wilderness, right? After coming out of Egypt and the Exodus experience, the Sinai experience, is 40 years, and I'm not going to go into any detail about those 40 years, but eventually they come to a place where they're about to now go into this promised land. And that's the setting for the book of Deuteronomy. So the book of Deuteronomy wants us to believe that this is where this book comes from, or where it was written. Maybe I put that incorrectly, but that's the presumed
Accepted
place for Deuteronomy, is 40 years after they come out of Egypt. But there's a couple of things we need to look at that really makes this very hard to, if we look at what the book itself actually tells us, it makes it hard to assume that that's what's really going on. So the first thing we need to realize about the book of Deuteronomy is it's written, if you read the first 5 verses and the last portion of this book, it's written by somebody else that refers to Moses in the third person. In other words, he's writing about Moses. And this is something you can go read up on your own. I'm not going to read the book of Deuteronomy here for you, but it's obviously a third person discourse, which tells us, and which makes it quite clear that that person, Moses, the person featured in the middle, which is spoken of in the third person, is not the person that actually wrote this version of Deuteronomy we are dealing with here, right? So that's something that, not a lot of people like to think of it like that. Our tradition tells us Moses wrote the whole Torah. But when you read the Torah itself, specifically in books like Deuteronomy, it becomes quite clear that it's not written by Moses, it's written by another person, and we don't really know who that person is. We can guess, but we don't really know. So it starts like this. The second thing that we find out in the first 5 verses is that this book is actually written from a perspective of the Israelites already being in Canaan, right? And this is a problem because Moses never entered Canaan. We know he died on the other side of the Jordan because of his disobedience. So the person writing this is not trying to hide from us the fact that the book is written from a post-Jordan perspective, if I can say. From the other side of Canaan, the book is actually written. So these are little clues that come up that makes it clear to us that this book could not have been written in the desert and by Moses. So it was written by someone after the death of Moses. We know that because of the latter parts in the book, the writer writes about the death of Moses. So unless we are willing to concede that Moses wrote about his own death in the third person in past tense, maybe think about that a little bit.
Yeah.
This is not written by Moses, but actually by some form of a scribe. In those days, not everybody could write, so it was a specialist activity, so probably some form of scribe. And the question is always then just like, when was it written? Like, okay, if it wasn't written by Moses, when was the book actually written? Okay. So obviously it was written after Moses, but the question is, how long after Moses does someone actually pen this stuff down? And in Deuteronomy 34, verse 5 and 6, and you can go read that, and that's kind of near the end, it says that the writer says, and no one knows his, which means Moses, no one knows his burial place to this day.
So it couldn't have been just as he died, because they would have remembered.
Yeah, well, the point that the scholars make is like this can't be within the generation of Moses because people would have known.
Yeah.
This can't be maybe 2 generations because people would. The grave of Moses is not going to be some obscure place that no one knows about. He's the absolute hero of the Israelites. It's going to be a place where everyone remembers. And so the point they're making is if nobody remembers where he was buried, we are talking about at least decades.
Yeah.
At least decades, meaning it leaves it open for even later,
Longer, yeah.
later periods, but at least decades, and many of them. So the location is unknown, which means it had to be a rather long time after the death of Moses. At least a generation or 2, right? To this day is a way of saying it's been a while, you know? I could say to this day we've never had a great leader again like Mandela, and that could mean 1 or 2 generations, but if nobody can remember where he was buried, sheesh.
Long time ago.
That's a long time ago, right? And then there's another verse in verse 10 of the same chapter where the writer says, and there has never been a prophet like Moses since. Which once again indicates we are talking about quite a long time.
And quite a legend.
He's become legend.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. And it's these clues, if Moses is not the writer and it wasn't written on the eastern side of Jordan, then the question is when and where and so on. It seems like it was written in the Canaanite side, in other words, the Israeli kingdom side of the Jordan, and quite a long time after. Question is, how long after? Deuteronomy 2:12 speaks of, let me just read this for you, that it goes like this. The children of Esau destroyed the Horims and took their land, as Israel did, this is a quote, unto the land his possession, which the Lord gave unto him. So the writer writes in the past tense of Israel taking the land. So this is obviously not during the time of Moses, but at a later period in which Israel had already taken the land. So this almost puts us again even further. It puts us beyond the conquest times of the early judges, or Joshua, for instance. So it just seems like there's so much evidence here that the actual writer, the guy that puts pen to paper here, is not writing in the time of Moses, at least. So Canaan had already been entered from the point of the writer. And although, and this is the weird thing about Deuteronomy, that at points the writer makes it seem as if Moses is actually the one writing the piece of the content. Kind of like the past is brought into the present of the writer's audience. Maybe a way of writing, making those early events very real to the audience of the writer. And it seems like these indicators show us a real settledness already within the nation of Israel. And this is why most scholars, and I know I'm rambling on a little bit, but we're going to get to the point in a moment. Most scholars agree that Deuteronomy was at least written in a monarchical period, which means the time in which the kings were the nation was pretty settled under David, Solomon, and possibly even later. We also know from archaeology that writing, scribal activity in southern kingdom of Judah, it doesn't really, there's no real archaeological evidence for full-blown scribal activity until the 7th century, which is quite a long time after, right? So Deuteronomy 4:37-38, once again, it's just a little bit of portions from the book to show you why people are saying that this book wasn't written in the desert and why it wasn't written by Moses. Moses here speaks. Listen to this. This is so weird. Moses says this, quoting, "To drive out the nations from before you, greater and mightier than you, giving you their land and inheritance as it is this day." What the heck? There's something is wrong here, right?
He's quoting Moses.
Well, no. He is writing as if Moses is writing this. But there's no way that Moses could write from this position because he died before any of this happened. Okay, so the point here is not that anyone is trying to deceive anyone. The point here is that it is obvious that Moses didn't write this, number one. And it's obvious that writer doesn't care whether you know it's Moses who didn't write this or not. It's his way of bringing that experience into his audience's present, right? So once again, the writer writes from a place where Israel had already possessed the land, but he speaks as Moses, right? So a considerable time had elapsed before this book was actually penned down. And how do scholars estimate the time in which the book of Deuteronomy was written? And here the tire is going to hit the road for the idea of love. Now here it is. Scholars estimate that the book of Deuteronomy was finally redacted, edited, put together by scribes in the 7th century. And there are many reasons for this. But one of the greatest reasons for this, now here it is, right, is that the format of Deuteronomy, this format that puzzles us so much, that unsettles us so much, resembles very much the type of suzerain treaties that was used during this time. Okay, so what is a suzerain treaty? Well, a suzerain is an overlord or a great Assyrian king or his empire. And often they would write treaties, or you could call this a covenant or a contract, in which they would go to smaller city-states, smaller kingdoms, which were called vassals, and they would write to them saying, hey, be part of my kingdom or I'm coming for you. If you're part of my kingdom, I'll look after you. You've got to pay your tax. Send me some army men when I need them. Send me some soldiers. But if you don't, I'm coming to destroy you. So these treaties were written. They were very one-sided. They were written by the greatest empires of their time to bring in and coerce smaller nations to become part of their empire. And this is kind of how they grew their empire. So we have examples that we have unearthed in archaeology of dozens of these treaties, for instance, from the early times of the Hittites. All right? Not going to say too much about this. I'm just going to throw it out there. And the letters and the treaties they wrote with the smaller nations around them. And this is from the 2nd millennium BC. So we're talking about, if we take Bible timeline, before Abraham. Right? They were already busy writing these type of treaties. They took the general format that looks like this. The suzerain would write, we are the Hittites, we are powerful, this is what we've done, this is how powerful we are. And then it would go to, you need to be subject to us, right? And then it would go to, but we will protect you. Like we'll look after you. But in returns, we need your full obedience, your loyalty, and your devotion. Normally this was to actually the emperor, because the emperors of those kingdoms, they were gods in a sense, right? But the last format of this, the last little portion of these type of Hittite suzerain treaties was, if you will rebel, if you should rebel, we will treat and we will deal with you very, very harshly. Okay, so these type of treaties already existed very, very long time before we even talking about Moses.
Yeah.
But our second example is the one that's relevant for us, because it seems like that Deuteronomy follows, to some reasonable sense, the treaties that were written during the 7th century by the Assyrians. Right? So if you know anything about your Bible history and the history of Israel, the Assyrians were basically the world empire at the time of the formation of the kingdom of Israel. And these kingdoms were constantly coming against Israel and Judah, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, but you know that it's the Assyrians that destroyed the 10 northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel, completely in the 8th century, and then came for Judah as well and almost took them, right? So Assyria were a serious threat in the late 8th and early 7th century for the kingdom of Israel. But the point here is just this, that Deuteronomy looks very much like an Assyrian treaty that the Assyrians would use. The king's name, I'm hoping I could actually pronounce this, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon from 680 BCE. His treaties were discovered, and they were discovered in 1956, which is really not that long, ago, right? It's quite recent for us. And these treaties contain striking similarities with the covenant or the treaty found in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's where,
for me, it just gets interesting.
Well, it's interesting because we need to realize that
there's context.
Whoever wrote Deuteronomy has a context.
Yeah.
There's a reason why Deuteronomy is written in such a harsh, overlord fashion. Where was the example of this type of writing? Was there? And this is exactly the point, that there was actually in somehow the cultural memory of the ancient Near East, there was this known way in which kings force themselves onto smaller nations, and the format of those things, it seems like at least we can say Deuteronomy swims in the same type of waters as these Assyrian treaties. No one is saying that Deuteronomy was people finding an Assyrian treaty and copying it. Nobody is saying that, but it was quite obvious. It is quite obvious that it follows the same format. And the question would simply have to be, why does it follow the same format? You know, I would expect, and this is where I have to change the way I look at the scriptures, I would expect the Bible to be 100% unique because of my view of the Bible, but it just seems, as we are understanding the ancient Near East better, it just isn't that unique. There's progress, but it's not completely unique. It does take on forms, literature, and the mindset of the people around them. So Deuteronomy is not necessarily a copy. So this led scholars to conclude that Deuteronomy is really swimming in the same type of waters, cultural, literary waters of the 7th century Assyrians.
Okay.
So the 7th century is important, just quickly, because in the late 8th century, just a couple of years before that, the Assyrians completely wiped out northern tribes. So the southern tribes were living in the threat of this mighty, mighty and very cruel empire. If you want to read a little bit about them, they were extremely cruel. They came and they were a real threat for southern Judah, which was kind of smaller really than the upper Israel. There was a threat that Assyria would come for them. But there was also the temptation that Judah might sign a treaty with Assyria.
Yeah.
It would kind of make sense because they know they can't beat them. And for their children to live and for their families to keep on existing, let's pay some tax and make peace and we can carry on. So there was a temptation. They just say, guys, you saw what happened to northern Israel. Let's do things different and survive.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the atmosphere of the late 8th and the 7th century in Israel and Judah, is the absolute threat of this cruel, cruel, cruel empire. Okay, I'm not going to read all that again. I've said all that. So this is the context.
The point of you saying there's a chance that they were like, you know what, let's be safe and go with these Assyrians. The point of you saying that is that maybe then Deuteronomy, if I think what you're saying, is to say, no, don't, I know it's tempting, but don't go, but here's another proposal on the table in the same style and format as the ones that you know accustomed to in terms of treaty, but ours is to God and not to.
So this is,
Syria.
as I understand, the conclusion of most historical, critical, biblical scholars, is they estimate that Deuteronomy is written to tell Israel, don't sign with Assyria. God is our sovereign. Yahweh is our suzerain.
Yeah.
He will look after us. And so it was a polemic in a sense. It was a call. It was a motivational argument for Israel to come back to God, come back to the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments built into Deuteronomy, as you know. But to
in
say,
the language.
But that is exactly the point, Tori. It doesn't come in New Testament language to us. It doesn't come in that.
It comes rather this way because God is a loving God and He accepts you as you are, and He loves everyone, the whole world, for He gave His only begotten Son. And we're not there yet.
No, we're definitely not there yet. And the scribes or the writers of Deuteronomy actually kind of, I don't really know how to say this, they see calling Israel back to God in the same way that a suzerain would call a vassal into and this might help you. Yeah, absolutely, urgency, but maybe they just didn't understand God the way that John the Apostle understood him. You've got to think that is a possibility at some point. But this helps us to make sense of why Deuteronomy is so harsh, why it looks like there's one party forcing their way onto another party, why it looks like I will love you if you will love me, or serious consequences, why there's such a long list of blessings and curses. It does help us to make sense of it. So Deuteronomy is kind of like an argument for the Israelites or the Judahites that are now left. A lot of Israel came down into Judah also, but to follow Yahweh in the midst of an imminent, powerful Assyrian threat. And this is the reason that, the Deuteronomic covenant, big word, takes on the form of the Assyrian treaty to a large extent, like placing the writing of Deuteronomy within the 7th century. Right. So that's quite a bit later than what we would expect it. No one is saying by this that Moses didn't exist or that the Ten Commandments didn't exist earlier. We're just saying that the book Deuteronomy was not written by Moses, but was written by someone much later, in the time of the Assyrian threat, in the time of increased scribal activity within Judah, taking on that format to call Israel back to what Moses was telling them, back to the law, back to monotheism to a large degree also. That's not for tonight. But so, a side note here is that devotion and love found in Deuteronomy is a covenant word. In other words, the word love, and this is where we get to our topic, the word love in Deuteronomy is not, I love you so much, I just want to be with you, and I just wish we could share this life together. It's not that type of love. It's also not a selfless love at all. Love in Deuteronomy means full devotion, full obedience, full alliance.
So we need to see that when we see the word love.
We have to. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Right. So love is, in Deuteronomy, love is really like a treaty language, covenant word, which is not, it doesn't look like agape, but this is the reason why it doesn't look like agape. So quickly, just from the format of the Assyrian treaties, they kind of follow the following sequence, if you like. Firstly, the identification of the suzerain. So the treaty starts with the suzerain identifying himself. Now, if you know a little bit about Deuteronomy, you'll understand, I am the God that did this and this. I brought you out of Egypt. I did this for you. I did this. I'm the firstborn, the Red Sea. The suzerain identifies himself, shows his power, his authority, and what he can do if he wants to, right? Number 2 is a reminder of the relationship between the suzerain and the vassal. And so in the books of Deuteronomy, even in other books, it's like, I brought you out, you're kind of like a son to me. I took you. Isaiah would use some language sometimes about like you were like a girl on the side of the road, left, forsaken by everyone. We have a relationship. We come a long way. I am powerful. Now this is what I'm putting on the table. The third one would be stipulations. So these treaties have stipulations. You know, the Assyrian treaty might contain something like tax, resources, how you have to open up your trade routes for me, etc., etc., etc. Now Deuteronomy is no shortage of some serious stipulations. You can go read them if you want to spend an afternoon slightly falling asleep most of the time. Then number 4 would be, and this is something they did with the Assyrian treaties, which we kind of know was also done in Israel, is they take a copy of this and it would have to be placed in a very special place in the vassals' chambers and then brought out and read, so that everyone in the nation would be constantly reminded of what the treaty looks like, what the obligations were, and of course, what was the consequences. The beautiful consequences for full obedience and alliance to Assyria, but at the same time, the horrible dread that would hit their lives, the lives of their family, and you know, their existence should they not. So this is number 4. Number 5 would normally have some form of witness to the covenant or the treaty. Somebody would have to say, these people are the witness to our agreement. So in Deuteronomy, and this is something that happens often in the Bible, but specifically in Deuteronomy, heaven and earth are called as witnesses. To witness this day, the agreement that we're signing, that we're entering into, right? And then finally, the one that's really unsettling in Deuteronomy, that is the idea of, that we find in the Assyrian treaties, is the rewards for the obedience and the absolute dire consequences for disobedience, rebellion, or disloyalty. So this is the format the Assyrian treaties take, and this is the format that Deuteronomy takes. Pretty much. I mean, it is a very long book. It's not a quick book, and there are many other details that might have been added or things left away a little bit. But in essence, this is what Deuteronomy is. God says, I'm your Lord, I'm your God. I've done this for you. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to do this, 10 commandments, stipulations, Levitical laws. Write this thing down, teach it to your children, put a copy somewhere where you can read it to the people often. I call heaven and earth to witness that we're entering into this covenant today. And should you follow, I will bless your pomegranate trees and your vineyards and your armies and your da-da-da-da. But should you violate this thing, I will come down on you like a sledgehammer. And this is what Deuteronomy is. And this is why it's so tempting to say, wow, it does look like Deuteronomy sounds like the suzerain treaties we find in those ancient times, right? So Deuteronomy follows this format roughly, and I don't want to, I'm not going to call them out in chapter versions for you. So this helps us to understand why Deuteronomy is so harsh. Why does it look so strong and so forceful and so one-sided? The curses are so over the top. This is why. In conclusion today, and this to me, I know for some this is perplexing, that the thought that the Bible might have swam. I
don't know.
Tori's English, I'm Afrikaans, by the way. Might have swam in the same waters as ancient literature, but the more you study ancient Near Eastern literature, you realize that a lot of the Bible actually draws from some of these places.
It's not like a blank abyss in history with the Bible hanging in the air.
No, it didn't drop
It
out of
happened
the
and
air.
was created amongst other...
Out from. Yeah. So for me, this is actually a huge sigh of relief when I realized and read this, because I had a real existential crisis about what God might be like. And when I realized that, hey, wait a minute, this is why Deuteronomy looks like this, it was a huge sigh of relief, and really a kind of a fresh and simple and fresh explanation. Here's it. Here it is. Deuteronomy. Here's it. Deuteronomy is not a book about the agape love of God.
Yeah.
That's not what this book is, right? And this is the sad part for me, because Christians go there all the time to try and find out what God is like, what God will do and what God won't do. And even New Testament Christians spend their time, admittedly, not in the curses, but in the blessings, to say, but you see, these are the promises we have. We have to be careful of that, because you have to take the whole thing. You can't just take parts. You can't cherry pick the nice parts. You've got to take.
It can't be that half of it is for you and the other half is not for you.
Absolutely. So it's not a book written about the love of God. There's too much fear in there, Tori.
Yeah. And the love of God. When you say the love of God, we think agape, and this word love is not even agape.
This word love is something
of a
else.
treaty of,
Exactly. Or that's what it looks like in context, right? It's a polemic. Deuteronomy is a polemic argument, not to give in to the massive, cruel Assyrian Empire.
What is a polemic argument?
Polemic argument is almost politically orientated, to draw people in for a specific cause. And they're calling Israel to stay loyal and come back to the full obedience of the covenant with Moses, etc. Devotion to Yahweh. And here's the good part. It worked.
Yeah, it did what it had to do.
It did what it had to do. And the reality is that if it didn't do this, we might never have had a New Testament. We might never have had Judah or a Mary producing a Jesus. So
what if they... Not so what, but... Okay, so there was a couple of generations that didn't believe that was what God was like.
I think so, yes.
And that's okay, because it led to
where we are today.
On the trajectory.
I think it's coming to terms with the idea that Scripture really is a journey. It's a generational journey that builds and progresses over time. And it's not God that changes. We are the ones changing, understanding better, coming to better grips with who He might be. So Deuteronomy in that way is at best love for beginners, because it's a love that's based in complete obedience and to be honest, fear.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I personally would say, I don't know if I can use the word love in Deuteronomy, but some would like to make the case that it possibly does. Deuteronomy does not resemble or put on display the love of God that we should be emulating. I think this is the takeaway from all of this. This is the way it lands. What's the point of this whole study? Do not go read Deuteronomy to learn, number one, what God is like. Number two, how you should be treating people around you. your employees, those that work for you, your wife, your children, your congregation members. Deuteronomy should not be used to say to people, you know what, if you do things wrong, these curses, you might be sick because you did things wrong. Come on. That is going straight to Deuteronomy and treating God like an Assyrian emperor.
Yeah.
That's basically what that does. So this is where I want to land with all of this, is to say, hey, Deuteronomy is not for that. It's a small window, small time window into the journey of God with the Israelites. It is their view of Him. It is not Him showing who He is. And I know that's slightly controversial, but I just my conscience won't allow me to go anywhere else with this.
It's a relief, actually.
It is not an example of the type of love that God has for us. Okay, so if we want to see what type of love God has for us, we go to Jesus, right? So that's kind of what it means to be a Christian, I think, to some degree. There's too much ancient Near Eastern culture locked up in Deuteronomy for us to use it to make conclusions about God.
Yeah.
At best, we can understand it as a small window into their journey with God, their tiniest or their contemporary understanding of what God must be like. I have no doubt in my mind, and I think you've already said that these Israelites possibly thought of God as very similar to an Assyrian king. That works in the same ways. I mean, to me, that's clear from Deuteronomy, that if a scribe was willing to pen that down, that was his view of what God was like.
Yeah.
But it is not the view that I need to be taking. I want to end with a New Testament scripture, and I know the New Testament can also be controversial in these ways, and there are passages of judgment and etc. But I want to say at least this, that I think what happens in the New Testament, you have people, Jews, who have inherited a specific view of God, Deuteronomy being possibly a huge portion of what that view looks like. But something else happens in the New Testament because of Jesus. The life Jesus lived, the crucifixion, his love for people, made Jews that became Christians think differently about God. That to me is quite obvious. That they thought differently about God after they experienced Jesus. Now John is one of the best examples of exactly this. John is the one who writes saying, how much time I got? 7 minutes. John is the one that writes saying, we handled him, we touched him, we spoke to him, and now we want to share him with you. Right? Yeah. That's what 1 John kind of is about. John 1, sorry. And it is John, of course, who writes quite a lot about love. I would say John and Paul are the two people that really get stuck into and what I would call a new way of understanding the love of God. So amidst that old culture that was there, that pervaded the way they thought, something new emerges. You can call it revelation, you can call it the light that shines in the darkness, whatever terms you want to use for it. Something new emerges here where the actual nature of love due to the life of Jesus is illuminated, and then we get, and this is the stage set for what John writes in John 4 verse 18 to 19. John writes this, and I hope that, and I'm not going to explain, I'm going to resist the temptation to run away with this. I'm not going to do that. I normally do. I'm just going to read it. It says the following, John 4 verse 18 to 19. John says, there is no fear in love. There is no fear in love. But a perfect love casts out fear. Because fear has punishment. He that fears does not have perfect love. And then I think it's verse 19 says, we love him because he first loved us. I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's pretty clear that the love we're expecting from God is going to look a little bit different than what we find in Deuteronomy. So I just want to leave you with this. This is the most important part that I take away, that has really radically changed my life, really, and that is still busy, let me rather say, busy changing me, is the realization that I'm no longer going to Deuteronomy to go find out what the love of God looks like. I'm not doing that. When I go to
even conditional.
Yeah, absolutely. The character of God. I go to Deuteronomy to see a portion of the journey of Israel with God.
Yeah.
Mostly from their perspective.
Yeah.
And I accept that the New Testament is making us aware of a new type of love. A new, can I use your words, character or mind that exists within God. And it's not that God had changed. It's that we saw a light. We were the ones that sat in darkness that saw the light. Even us with all our scriptures and our Old Testament, Paul with all his whole Old Testament, and knowing it so well, someone like Paul eventually had to come to the realization that he used the scriptures to persecute God. That's what happened to Paul. Because he misunderstood the nature of God.
Yeah.
And this is why I think Paul eventually is one that writes so extensively on the love of God in 1 Corinthians 13, for instance. And 1 Corinthians 13 is just a mind-boggling piece of writing. It doesn't suit Deuteronomy. It doesn't fit into Deuteronomy. You can't make 1 Corinthians 13 fit into Deuteronomy. It doesn't, and it shouldn't. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
It shouldn't fit. So I leave you with that today to just think about this, that where there's fear, that's not love. Whatever the treaty looks like, if it produces fear, it's just simply not love. Love does not produce fear.
Yeah.
It's mutually exclusive. They don't hold shares in each other's companies.
Yeah.
They are separate things, and to some degree, they really are opposites.
Yeah.
And that is it
That's all, folks.
for this. And I want to leave you with just
the
this,
last
that
of the
God
love.
loves you.
Is this the last?
I don't know.
Oh.
We'll see. But I want to leave you at least with this, that God does love you. And not in a Deuteronomic way,
Yeah.
but in a selfless, uncircumstantial oozing of who He is,
Yeah.
an unconditional love. So, that's good news. All right.
Good news.
Okay. Guys, thanks so much
Thank
for
you for
being with
listening.
us. Yeah. It was great to have you with us.
Have a good week.
Have a
Enjoy
good one.
Your Valentine's.
Yes.
Find someone to show some love to.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, guys. Cheers.